I wanted to give thanks to John and the Center for Studies of Higher Education for having me here. I hope everyone is partly awake. This is always the worst time of day to teach, right? It's the post-lunch lull, so I will try my best to keep you awake. I'm going to delve a little deeper into what Dean Brady talked about in terms of the tensions between universities and this idea of nationalism, and really to talk about the degree to which, in the United States context at least, the role of universities in relationship to both nationalism and globalization has shifted over time, and that it's important to realize that there is no one sort of set of US interests in the context of the purposes of higher education and then how it intersects with immigration. So if you think about the growth of higher education in the United States, it really took off after World War II, partly because of the expansion of the GI Bill. If you look at many of the universities here in California, they were built during that time period. And then the second thing that happened historically was the passage of the National Defense Education Act in 1958. And this was a piece of legislation that came out of basically worry based on, because the Russians had launched Sputnik. And the US government decided that we needed to invest in education at all levels, particularly in science, in order to keep up, right? And that this was a national security problem. This was a way to shore up our nationalism. So you can see both of those trends within higher education as being really about increasing the sense of the US as a nation, advancing US global hegemony, and really ensuring our national security as a nation state. But what happens over the course of the 60s and 70s as the United States level of hegemony decreases and other parts of the world begin to grow at faster rates, you have universities actually becoming more global in much the same way that our economy becomes much more global. And that the idea of intellectual work is now globalized, right? So this idea that international competitiveness actually requires that research universities and the kinds of intellectual work that happens on campuses like Berkeley has to be about the best of the best in the world, right? Not about just the US nation state and shoring up our national interests. And that innovation requires that we, in fact, take ideas and people and resources from everywhere in order to advance whatever enterprise we're studying at the time. And as a result of that, the United States actually has the most international students of any country in the world. This is according to the Institute of International Education, did a study called the Open Doors Study. This is the 2017 numbers. We have just over 1 million international students in our institutions of higher education in the United States, which comprise about 5% of the student population. An important aspect of this is they bring $39 billion worth of resources into our universities, right? Because many of these students come to the United States to study, and they bring their own funding, right? And so even here on the Berkeley campus, many of our revenue-generating ideas that are being proposed to address our budget crisis assume that our market, where we're going to be able to raise this revenue and have these programs, online education and others, is an international market, right? And so those resources are really actually sustaining higher education in the United States. And so that's a very different vision of US interests than a much more sort of xenophobic, we need to close the doors vision that we get out of many of the folks in the Trump administration. And the people who are studying in our universities internationally, about just under half of them are concentrated in the STEM fields. But at the graduate level in particular, you have 65% of graduate students who are international in STEM. And the most common area is engineering, right? So thinking about what is that side of campus, how are they surviving? And if you recall universities' responses to the travel ban that the Trump administration passed, here in Berkeley, I believe the number was about 40% of our postdocs were in fact international. And so understanding that much of the intellectual labor on this campus is being carried out by non-US nationals, and that has a very important impact on the university if that changes. And the negative story that came out of that report was that there's been a 7% decline in that enrollment over the past year. And one could imagine it's because of concerns. You're going to start a graduate program, you're going to invest all these resources, and then suddenly you're going to be told you can't come back. That is something that would give someone pause, and we have plenty of competitors in other parts of the world. And so this conflict, right, between immigration policy becoming more restrictive for all people, regardless. I don't know if folks saw, there was a news story today that the Trump administration is considering not allowing spouses of H-1B holders to have status in the United States. So basically, you can come as a high-tech worker, you can't bring your partner or your family or anyone else, right? So there's a real tension here in terms of seeing the scientific enterprise as being about global competitiveness and US nationalism. And just a quick recent example of why this is important, if you remember, one of the biggest finds and discoveries in astrophysics happened this year, where you had, they were able to see, and I should say this as I am not an astrophysicist, but it seemed kind of cool that they were able to see what's called a kilonova, which tells us where gold and platinum come from. And the reason that this was possible is because observatories across the world cooperated to measure what was happening simultaneously, and it was supposed to be the most widespread cooperative enterprise on the part of scientists in history, and that is what we are doing in a place like Berkeley. And again, that's very different from US nationalism. You bring that together with our admissions process and sort of changes in how we bring people on a campus, building on what Dean Brady said, we're supposed to be bringing the best and the brightest, right? And not care about people's nativity, not care about their background. In fact, the process that has happened over the last 20 years on university campuses is to define merit much more broadly and to think about people's life experiences and hardships that they've overcome as, in fact, something positive that will add to the student body at Berkeley and really make us a stronger place for people to study. And so if we think about the role of undocumented students on this campus, they are in fact part of that movement. We bring the best of the brightest and we don't care about people's legal status, at least in the admissions process. But then what happens is once folks get here, universities sit at this sort of intersection of then federalism, of state policy and national policy. So here in California, we have what's called the California DREAM Act, which allows undocumented students to access financial aid using state funds, but they still cannot access financial aid at the federal level, right? We have the federal ruling in Plyler versus Doe, which gives undocumented students access to education in K-12. It makes it very unclear what their rights are in higher education. And so universities find themselves in this place where they're trying to bring the best and the brightest. They've accepted students. Their legal status then makes them be in a very precarious position, and university's job is to, in fact, take care of their students, right, and make sure that they're able to, in fact, successfully have their education. And so if you think about it, the idea of exclusion that is at the core of the new nationalism that Dean Brady talked about is, in fact, antithetical to what universities are doing, as he mentioned, but it explains then why you have this attempt, in fact, to hurt some of the most vulnerable. If you think about graduate students are not rolling in money by any stretch of the imagination. There was just a study on this campus that about 40% of them are actually food insecure at Berkeley because of the cost of living in the Bay Area. So if they get taxed on their tuition benefits, which is money they never see, that's going to very significantly impact the kinds of students who can think about engaging in graduate education in the United States. And it's going to limit the folks who can do that work to people who have other kinds of financial resources, and again, limit who can be included in this vision of higher education. And so I think it's that conflict between the vision that a place like Berkeley has of sort of ideas and cosmopolitanism and the vision of the current Trump administration, which is really about limiting opportunity and making things inwardly focused. On a practical level, though, I just want to end by saying, since I was asked to talk about the status of DACA students on this campus, to just give people a little bit of history in the sense that the status of undocumented students, at least at Cal, has changed dramatically. I was an undergraduate student here from 1987 to 1992. At the time when I was a student here, which is not that long ago, I'm old but not that old, you could have a driver's license if you were undocumented. You could have access to federal financial aid. You could have access to California aid. There was no difference in terms of your ability to access the resources to be able to get through your studies here at Berkeley. That changed significantly in the early 2000s, and so until the passage of the California DREAM Act, most of these students did not have access to any financial aid. And so what they would do is they would enroll in twice as many classes in one semester so that then they could take incompletes in half of them, not register the next semester so they wouldn't have to pay fees, and then do the coursework for those courses in the second semester, and that's how they managed. They lived on couches, they had no food. Many of them still, even with access to California DREAM Act money, are not able to take care of their basic needs. And that is only going to get worse under the current regime. When people lose DACA, it's very unclear if they're going to be able to work on campus, how that's going to work, how they're going to have access to the resources that they've had. And the part that I find heartbreaking is, at least for last semester was the first time since I've been a faculty member that I had one of my undocumented students come up to me after the end of the semester and ask me what kind of graduate program she could go into if she didn't end up being able to live in the United States. Right? That for the first time in her life, she was imagining that her future was elsewhere, it wasn't here. And what is transferable if she ended up getting kicked out. And this is a student who at that point had DACA. This was before they got rid of the program. And so I think just appreciating the significant stress that these students are under, and the fact that they're already among our most vulnerable students, and how their situation really does, I think, they are at the heart of this tension of the university really trying to educate and bring forward these amazing, resilient young people, and the fact that our federal legal system is making it very hard, if not impossible, for them to actually realize their potential. And so I think that's an exact place where this, sorry, that's my time being up. They are really, I think, a sign of this tension, and we're hoping that people on campus, we can all work together to try to figure out how to not make them the victims of this particular conflict. Thank you.